Hi, everyone. Welcome back to National Association of Adoptees and Parents Adoption Happy Hour. My name is Greg Gentry. I'm a domestic infant adoptee from the baby scoop era, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest here in a minute, who is coming to us from the UK, Annalisa Toccara-Jones. And before we get started, we do have some housekeeping items. We'd like to go ahead and read a little bit of our disclaimer here for how the event will go here. So just one second here. So our mission is to educate, elevate, and empower. Please remain on mute, raise your hand on screen or virtually to be recognized. And you may post your questions or comments in the chat. We do encourage that, and that always makes for a more lively interaction. So we appreciate any comments you may have. If you are experiencing a serious mental health event or suicidal thoughts, please contact a licensed professional at the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by dialing 988. And remember, this is a public meeting with no guarantee that information or identity is confidential, and portions of this event are recorded and may be shared in our private happy hour group on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. So with that, I would like to introduce our guest tonight. Annalisa Toccara-Jones is a communication specialist, researcher, and founder of Family Narratives, a consultancy focused on improving how adoption and care are communicated. She works with organizations through training, facilitation, and consultancy to strengthen language, messaging, and representation. Her work brings together research, practice, and lived experience to support more thoughtful communication. She is currently completing a PhD in journalism at the University of Sheffield, exploring how adoptees use social media to speak about adoption in their own words. So, Annalisa, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, thank you. And it's great to be with you all from the UK.
Yeah, so it's late for you, and we appreciate you making the time and effort to speak to us over here. And I was very excited that you agreed to be our guest here. As I've been following you on LinkedIn, which I think will be part of our conversation here about these platforms and the voices that adoptees are finding on platforms. And yeah, I'm just very happy that we can start to hear something of the work other adoptees are doing at different places in the world. So again, welcome and thank you.
No, thank you.
I wonder if we could start with just something basic, a little bit about your story as an adoptee, maybe a little bit about your adoption story, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I am born in the UK, in England, and I was adopted when I was 4, but I was placed with my adoptive parents when I was 1. So placed for like through foster care, basically. So both my adoptive parents are Black Jamaican. I'm mixed race, so I'm half white Welsh. My biological mother is Welsh, and my biological dad is Jamaican. So, interestingly, they met when I was obviously a baby. So my biological dad asked for me to be placed with a Jamaican family, which is really rare in the UK for that to happen. But like that did happen. And then we adopted I've got a sister. We're not biologically related, but we adopted her when I was about 6, I think. And as the story goes, I apparently chose her when she was in foster care, and I chose her, and that's how she became in our family. So I, as a young child, was always very much like, oh, adoption's great. I love being adopted. I was kind of that type of adoptee when I was
Yeah.
young. And my sister struggled with being adopted. So when we were younger, we used to have a lot of conversations between me and her. She would be like, oh no, I don't like being adopted, or she would share how difficult it was for her. And I kind of was very blasé and was like, no, it's great to be adopted.
Yeah.
And it was only when I was, I'd say, my late 20s, where I started to really think about what it actually meant to be adopted for me. And I had, without realizing, always struggled with being adopted. Just those feelings were quite internalized, and I just hadn't really processed them. So yeah, I guess that's kind of a bit about my story. I've grown up knowing a lot about my identity as a Jamaican person because my adoptive parents were very, very keen on me learning about my history, heritage, and culture. So I never had those kind of feelings of who am I in terms of my race. I've always been, I'm Black Jamaican. But then at the same time, because I never wanted to deny my biological parents, I was always like, well, I'm mixed race as well. So I didn't want to ever like not claim the mixed race side of me. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
just to give a bit of background into me and where I come from.
What's very interesting, you talked about something that sounds like, what we call coming out of the fog, right? In terms of
Yeah.
there were things that you had lived with and maybe hadn't had a chance to process or even known that you needed to process or should process. And suddenly there's a point, an age where there's an awareness that happens, right? And thrusts everything into a whole new light. And I wonder if did that start a lot of what you're now planning to do academically, for example. You have a very specific focus here, and I'd like to talk to you about that in just a minute here. But would you say that starting to process your life as an adoptee is what put you on a different path?
Yeah, 100%. So I struggled a lot in my 20s with kind of depression. And I didn't really know what I was doing with my life. So I went and I studied theology as a BA degree. And yeah, I just didn't know what I was doing. I was working in a shop in Pandora for quite so many years. My background is in marketing and communications, but I fell into that as a job. And I one day I was traveling home on the train, and I remember talking to my mum about being adopted on the phone. And I can't quite remember how the conversation came about. But all I remember saying to her was, well, adoptees are always the last choice. Like, we're never the first choice. And I remember her getting very upset. And she was like, she took it very personal, what I said. And we had this massive argument on the train home as I was coming home from work. She was on the phone. And the more I was thinking about that conversation, I think that moment for me was the coming out of the fog moment, which I don't know what prompted that. I can't remember because it was about, well, it was 10 years ago, actually. It was 2015, 16. And I was 29, I think, 28, 29. Can't quite remember, yeah, what prompted that. But from that moment, I think I just started thinking a bit more about being adopted. And then I was asked to take part in a newspaper interview on being mixed race and adopted. And it was that interview that really thrusted me into kind of the work that I'm doing now. Because that interview was posted on Twitter. And at that point, I had Twitter as a platform, didn't really use it. But then when that interview was posted, a lot of people started to retweet it. And then I had adoptees coming into my inbox on Twitter and just kind of either resonating with the article or wanting to connect with me more. And then I discovered adoptee Twitter. I didn't know about adoptee Twitter at this point. And it was adoptee Twitter really that, yeah, helped me to kind of think about my adoption in greater detail. So yeah, I would say that was the moment for me where it kind of was like I started to question a lot about what I'd been told about being adoption and my own adoption story.
Yeah. Did you find that you resonated more closely with things your sister had gone through? Were you?
Yeah, so after a time, yeah, so once I started to kind of really think about it, um, I really related a lot more to my sister. And definitely now, like my views and opinions on adoption now are so far apart from like younger Annalisa. And
Right.
even if you'd spoken to me, what, 6 years ago? So yeah, my sister and I have very close thoughts now on adoption. They still differ in terms of like I believe in abolishing the adoption system. My sister doesn't, so we do have different thoughts on that. But in general, yeah, I'm definitely more aligned to how she was feeling in her younger years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's really cool to hear, actually. Because I know sometimes I hear with siblings who are adopted and are not biologically related that they diverge a lot, and they never really are able to have some of these conversations or start to see things in a more unified way. So that's wonderful that you were able to find more unity with her through what you were experiencing yourself. So
yeah.
when you found the platform, Twitter platform, and suddenly you had people popping up in your inbox and resonating. The experience of hearing from adoptees, was that something you were used to at all? Or was it
No.
suddenly like, wow, they're all here?
So I only knew one other person growing up who was adopted, and she was quite young, a lot younger than me. So obviously I knew my sister, and then yeah, this other person, and myself and this other person had never actually spoke about being adopted. I had just heard things about how she was feeling about being adopted secondhand. So I never really, yeah, hadn't met anybody else. Also, I guess to kind of put this into context as well, where I grew up, it was a very white neighborhood. I went to a white school. I was one of 5 black kids in my school. And in my primary school, so I was about 5, I think, at the time, I got bullied for being adopted. And I came home one day crying about it to my parents. And my mum said to me, never tell anybody you're adopted. Because for her, she was doing it as like a protection sort of thing. But now looking back on it, I do question how much of it was protection for my own safety, or was it also, something that was kind of internally within her.
Right?
And I never spoke about being adopted to anybody. So when that news article came out, that was the first time that I'd really spoken about being adopted. And even my best friend, she was just like, had never really heard me talk about it, and I was really surprised because my first school friend, she actually messaged me when that article came out, and she went, I didn't know you were adopted. And I
Hmm.
was like, what?
Yeah.
Like, because I was surprised because she was my first school friend, and she was like, I didn't know you were adopted, had no idea. And I was like, yeah. And then I even had another friend going, you're not adopted. And I was like, I am adopted. It was just my mum had always said to me, like, don't talk about adoption to anybody, so I didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, so when that article came out, and I started meeting other adoptees, it was this like mind-blowing experience because I was really relating to some of the things that other adoptees were talking about. And it just felt really, really nice to finally, yeah, be in some type of connection. Um, and I spent like the first year that I was on adoptee Twitter, I didn't resonate actually with a lot of the things that were being posted. So, for example, adoption abolition, I didn't resonate with that when I first heard about it. I was just a bit like, what is this? This is a bit confusing. Why are people talking about this? And there were other things that I was just like, no, I don't relate. And so I did spend a whole year literally like reading lots of these tweets and not participating in kind of anything, just kind of reading and learning and yeah, and just
Yeah.
kind of processing the like how I was feeling about certain things. But it was through Adoptee Twitter that really kind of made me think more about the system of adoption, how it works, and how our own individual stories then play into that. And it reframed a lot of my thought about how adoption. There was one tweet specifically by an adoptee who I am still in contact with, who had written about how the system intersects with so many social justice issues. And I had never realized that until I saw that tweet. I had
Yeah.
just been looking at my own adoption experience as my personal individual experience without actually seeing it, that it fits into this global system of how, as a society, we operate under capitalism and patriarchy. And I just had never seen it before.
Yeah. And so you lived under a narrative and probably were not as aware of it. And then coming into awareness of it and seeing how far reaching it is and the implications of it having these global roots and the way it's all connected, and realizing there's this, as you said, all these intersections and social issues and this injustice that happens. So there are people who will feel that and think, I feel like I should do something. No, I feel like I have to, or maybe you found yourself already doing it without even thinking that you had taken a step forward. But at some point, you must have started to produce your own content and put your own material out. I mean, I remember seeing you, and I've only been out of the fog for almost 5 years now. So you predate me. Everybody seems to have gotten there before I did. But thank goodness, because there are so many trailblazers and people who have laid down significant roots in this and have been challenging this system. And And it is, I think, a global system, right? I know it
Yeah.
manifests differently in different contexts, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you've found out about this narrative or pondered about it.
Yeah. So again, for me, the way that it, I guess, kind of transpired was I was on Twitter and yeah, reading lots of this information. And I'm an activist at heart, so I do a lot of community activism. I was heavily involved in Black Lives Matter in 2016. I led one of the protests where I'm living, my own town centre. Connected a lot into the global network of Black Lives Matter activists, and so I was doing a lot of that work, that community advocacy. I set up an organisation that centred around Black history, culture, and heritage in the city that I'm in. I then created our city's first festival for Black History Month. So I was doing a lot of this work in advocacy, in person. And the adoption thing kind of just happened. It kind of sprung on me. It wasn't something that I'd ever considered. Like, if you had told me even 10 years ago I would be doing a PhD looking at adoption, communication, narratives, honestly, I would have laughed at you, because that adoption was never on my list of things. Like, it just wasn't. And even now, I'm just like, how have I kind of made this my thing, my kind of niche? Because like, my background is marketing and communications, but like I said, adoption was just something that was part of me, but I didn't realize it would become so focal to my life. So when I was using Twitter at that point, I was still doing a full-time marketing job for in corporate. And I was using Twitter as more of my escape route in terms of how I was feeling about being adopted. So I would tweet things that were very personal to me. I It was more of a, I'm tweeting in the abyss just to get things off my chest because I've got no one else to talk to about it. And I really didn't have anybody else to talk to. I was struggling in my own family. Hadn't really been getting on along with my parents for quite some years. There was a point where I was estranged from my parents. I didn't talk to my adoptive parents, and we had a very tense relationship. My sister and I, we are the best of friends at moments, and then we are like enemies and don't talk for about a year or two. So my sister and I go through these different patches, and I think because we're obviously adopted, so we're biologically very different. And I think I'm really interested in siblings and kind of the sibling relationships. I mean, this is just a personal research point, I
Yeah, yeah.
guess, but I am interested in how adoptees who are adopted together but biologically different relate to one another, because from my experiences, a lot of us as adoptees who are placed like that and not biologically related do struggle with one another. And so
That's what I
my
hear.
sister and I have this like best friend relationship, but also we are enemies at points. And so at that period, I didn't, and my sister won't mind me sharing her story because I do have permission to share her story.
Thank
I
you.
make sure I check with her on that. But my sister and I weren't getting along. My parents and I weren't getting along, and so I used Twitter as like the way that I could just express some of my thoughts. So there was a time where it was really like I was really struggling, and I remember being like drunk. I was drunk in bed, and it was probably about this time. It was midnight, and I remember just tweeting, and I was crying my eyes out, and I was just tweeting things that really I didn't realize that people were actually other adoptees were resonating with it. And so that is kind of how I was using Twitter. And so adoptees were resonating with my tweets. Then I had
Wow.
non-adoptees who were like, why are you saying such things about being adopted?
Yeah.
And so it was this like polarizing moment where I'm literally just tweeting my own individual thoughts. I wasn't expecting them to take off. And so that for me was kind of how I entered into what I do now. And it was predominantly because a lot of the things that I was tweeting, non-adoptees would be like, how dare you say that about adoption? And then start arguing with me about my own lived experience. And I was like, what are you
Yeah.
arguing with me for? Like, this is my lived experience. These are my thoughts. Why are you telling me what I should be thinking and not thinking about being adopted? And then adoptees were like, I'm so glad you're tweeting about this, and just the messages I was getting and the tweets I was getting. So yeah, I realized that there were narratives regardless of where we're placed in the world, because it wasn't just the UK adoptees I was talking to. It was actually a lot
Mhm.
of US adoptees and other adoptees in different countries. And so I realized that there was threads in a lot of what we were tweeting about in terms of isolation or not feeling like we're being heard. Um, and then even the systemic like issues surrounding adoption, when we think about like biological mothers and kind of having like being coerced into adoption. So there were all these threads and these narratives, and I remember just being really angry one day. I was literally just angry, and my so to kind of, I guess, fast forward a couple of years, my adoptive mother, she passed away. She had terminal cancer and she passed away. And so in that week that my adoptive mum passed away, that was the moment for me where I was like, right, I'm going to write a PhD proposal and I'm going to submit that and see where we get along with it. So I literally wrote my PhD proposal during the week that my mum died. But I didn't just do that. So this is how I coped with my adoptive mum's grief, like her passing. I then decided I was also going to write a book about the global adoption system. So I interviewed 26 adoptees from across the world. And at that point, I used Twitter to put a call out. And so I interviewed 26 adoptees. I spent 44 hours, I think it was, interviewing and talking to other adoptees. Wouldn't recommend that, because now I know that was my trauma response to dealing with my adoptive mum's death. But at that point, I was just like, I need to talk to people, and I need to do something that was like, would help me, because my mum and I had a very complicated relationship, as obviously she's my adoptive mum, but I loved her, but we struggled to understand each other. So my mum and I would have conversations about being adopted, but they would go only so far, because a lot of the things she took as personal, or at least I felt, obviously I don't know from her side, but I felt that she took them as a personal attack on her. So we could talk about adoption, and we did. My mum and I would sit at the dining table if I would go and visit, and we would put the world to rights, because we're both very talkative and both very opinionated. But there was this kind of like a wall sometimes, and she didn't understand me, I didn't understand her. And so when I was interviewing people about this book, and I remember having this conversation with my mum before she passed away, and we had a conversation about truth and what is truth. And I remember her saying to me, like, regardless of what you research, just remember that, like, you're placed in a good family. Being adopted isn't bad. Like, don't forget what truth is, your truth. And we had this whole conversation about your truth, my truth, what is truth. And so, I wrote this book, which sits on my laptop. It hasn't actually gone anywhere yet. But I wrote this book, and it was very cathartic for me. So I interviewed all these adoptees, and then also then at the same time submitted my PhD proposal. And at that point, when I first started, my PhD proposal was meant to be a critique of adoptee Twitter, how, like, basically looking at Twitter and how non-adoptees respond to adoptees, because I was angry. And so I was just like, how can these people tell me about my own lived experience? And so that initially was what I'd kind of submitted as a proposal. My thesis has changed a long way since then, but that was kind of where I was coming from with it. And I had actually done a master's prior to this in international public and political communication. So I applied into the same department. I'm based in journalism. So I applied to the same department and I got accepted. And they actually asked me to wait a year before submitting me onto the course. And I'm glad they did. In hindsight, I was quite upset that they asked me to wait a year at that point. But I'm glad they did, because obviously all of this was a trauma response from my mum dying. Okay. So it was like 3 months this was. They did ask me to wait a year, and I'm glad they did, because I needed that time to actually process and heal. I was very angry. I was very angry in general at that point. So we're only going back 4 years, but I was angry. And when my mum died, my dad actually brought up some of her, some things that were mine, some letters and things like that. And when I was going through these letters, I actually discovered that there were some solicitor letters, and in it there were things that described my biological mother, and I somehow had rediscovered my birth certificate. So I thought I had lost my birth certificate, and it was a bit bizarre. I thought I'd lost it, and then all of a sudden I found it again amongst a lot of my paperwork. And then I started rereading my adoption papers, because my adoptive parents were very meticulous at kind of filing things. So I actually had my adoption papers. And the more I was reading it, the more I was discovering and realizing that my biological mother didn't actually want to give me up for adoption. And she had stated that many times, 3 times actually, in my papers. The social worker has actually
Yeah.
written that she did not give consent for my adoption. So I suddenly discovered that actually my birth mother never gave consent for me, and she didn't. They actually went to court for consent. She never gave consent at any point. My biological dad did, but she did not. And so that made me even more angry, because I was just like,
Yeah.
the injustice of this. And then I guess this all happened at the same time. I then got in contact through ancestry DNA with my biological family on both sides,
Yeah.
discovered that my biological mum had actually passed away when she was 29 or 28, 28. And I would have been quite young at that point. And she actually she overdosed. And from what I've gathered is that she really, really struggled with me being adopted, which is literally what the social worker had put down in my file, my paperwork, that my biological mum would not cope very well with me being adopted. So that kind of, for me, fired up a lot inside of me. Like I wanted justice for her.
Mm.
And that is really where a lot of my fire comes from, is this justice. It's justice for her, for all biological mothers, first mothers who have had to give up their children, or been coerced, or their children being taken away. And so, yeah, that's kind of where it is. And then I guess justice for my own younger self as well, because I I really struggled as a child, but didn't realize how much I was struggling. And I think that as adoptees, we internalize a lot of things, and
Yeah.
you might meet somebody where you might have a conversation, and maybe that might trigger something. But I also think for quite a lot of adoptees, that maybe we don't ever like process these things, and so we keep them inside. And that was, I guess, what was happened to me. I had a voice inside, but it wasn't coming out. and, and then Twitter was kind of the moment where it happened. And then I
Yeah.
realized that yeah, I needed to do this research. So yeah, that's kind of where it all started for me,
That's
and
amazing.
how I
Yeah.
ended up doing what I'm doing now.
And when you first started to, like you said, speaking into the void, or what you thought was the void, it was actually full of people wanting to listen.
Yeah.
And that, wow, the
And it's
support
so
from that.
validating. Like, it was
Yes,
validating that
validation.
actually I wasn't going crazy, because I genuinely was like, how can I'm only seeing this and other people aren't seeing it? And what is going on? And I remember someone saying to me, she said to me, like, how can you talk about your, like, no, it was when I was going to do the search for my biological family. And I remember her being like, but what would your adoptive mum say? Like, what would your mother say about it? And I was
Oh
thinking, what
yeah,
does it matter about what my mum says about it? This is my story. I want to go find my biological parents. What does that matter?
right.
And I think a lot of people who aren't adopted do have this kind of notion that, oh, we shouldn't maybe go look for our biological family, or is steeped in this whole like gratefulness narrative, right? Of we should be thankful that we are adopted and that we've been saved from this horrible life. And that was kind of what I was experiencing, was this whole, yeah, kind of narrative being put on me. But it's my
Yeah,
choice if I want to go and get in contact or
right.
talk about adoption. I shouldn't have to keep this a secret. And I think because my mum had always said to me, don't talk about being adopted, the moment I did start talking about it, it was like I was free. Like, I just felt so free, and I feel free now. Like and I think, and my freeness, I think, has inspired other adoptees to be free, from what I've been told. So I'm like,
Great.
I choose to talk and share because I feel free, and why should I have to keep my own lived experience quiet, or not share my opinions? So yeah,
Yeah,
that's how I kind of, I guess, I never started to generate content or write my own content. It was just very natural. I was literally just spouting off my own thoughts and feelings, and
yeah, it
then
all
it
just
went
progressed
organic.
organically from where you
Yeah.
were. what you were going through. And we should have the right to
Yeah,
be people we are, to look for our own people. And yet you find that people in society, and even there are some adoptees, but in society in general, some people are really upset at that idea.
yeah,
And they view it as a betrayal. And what about the people that raised you? And um, to the point where, you sometimes hear about people that don't search until their parents have passed away,
yeah,
um, which is kind of tragic because it shows the way they've felt constrained and how they've wanted to do this, but couldn't find that there was a place for them to do it or understanding. And so this is this big overarching part of the narrative too, I think, of everyone. How could you do this? How could you want to do? But they have probably pursued things for a hobby like genealogy themselves. A lot of kept people, and that's okay, right? It's okay for them to know their story, but when we do it, it's kind of a shock. But I love that you were so passionate about it and wanted, and in the way you speak about feeling so free, like I'm able to do this now and speak this way, and why shouldn't I be able to do that? As you said, I'm absolutely certain you're inspiring other adoptees to feel the strength of what they can also achieve there and do for themselves, even if they're not going into academia, they're living their lived experience, and they want to feel validated too.
yeah. And I think for me, it was one of the reasons why I chose academia was, well, A, because I do enjoy researching, but also because I
Great.
realized quite quickly that um, and I don't know if it's the same in the US. I'm just talking from a UK perspective, but I realized quite quickly that in order to be taken credible within kind of adoption circles or just in general the sector, people like you to have some type of accreditation to your name.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of again another reason in as to why I chose to do a PhD, because I realized having doctor, because I was on a panel, I'd because I used to tweet a lot, I then became kind of asked to do a lot of talks and presentations, and I was on a panel with doctors. None of them were adopted. They all had a vested interest in the adoption system. They worked in the sector. They all had doctor before their name. And then there was me. And I really quickly realized in order to be taken seriously, it's probably better that I had, you know, a doctor before my name. And I'm not saying we all need to do that at all.
Yeah.
I just realized that for me, I'm academic by nature. And so it kind of made sense to just do a PhD. Um, and also because at that point, I was writing my book and I thought, if I'm going to write this book and do all this research for this book, then let me just kill two birds with one stone and do a PhD as well. Because I'm doing all this research, I might as well just also turn it into a PhD. So that's kind of, I just thought
Great.
it makes sense to do both.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, that was kind of my thinking behind the PhD. But yeah,
And I had a sense, and I think, with some of these pre-questions I gave, that was one of the ones I asked about was credibility and whether there was a strengthening of that with the credentials, and also about the idea that you almost can't be believed as
yeah,
an adoptee without that. Like,
yeah.
people are, what do you feel about that?
It makes me mad. It makes me absolutely
Yeah.
furious because and again, this is where it kind of came from for me, was my background is in marketing and communications. And before all this happened, before I did my PhD, I actually asked somebody who used to do a lot of work in terms of marketing and communications for National Adoption Week in the UK. Like I know you guys have a month over in America, we have a week. And to be real with you, I didn't actually know when I first started tweeting that National Adoption Week in the UK was a marketing recruitment week. I genuinely thought it was about celebrating us as
Oh,
adoptees. And then I quickly found out, oh no, it's actually about marketing recruitment for adoption. Had no idea.
yeah.
But I had asked somebody, could I get involved in the campaign? We have a campaign called We Can Adopt. No, You Can Adopt. And so I really wanted to get involved in like this campaign. And and I guess kind of put an adoptee lived experience spin on it, right? And I was turned down. The person said no. And I was just like, what? Like, I was quite flabbergasted because
Wow.
that's my
Yeah.
background. Like, marketing comms is my background. That's my bread and butter. So it felt quite personal to me. And the person actually said to me, because it was during the time I was tweeting, and they said, I don't feel that you're kind of that what was it, that you're healed enough. That was pretty much what she was trying to say, was that she felt that I was a bit too angry to be involved in this campaign. So it wasn't coming from a professional background, it was coming from what I was tweeting. So, and I just thought that's insane, because out of everybody, like in terms of probably the people working on the adoption campaigns, I'm probably one of the best people for them to actually have in their campaign, given my years of experience in marketing and
Yes.
comms and then being adopted. And so, so yeah, so that was kind of, again, one of the things I quickly realized was that I was always just going to be seen as this like lived experience adoptee. And a lot of the invites that I was getting to speak at events was about my lived experience. And so that was upsetting me as well, because I didn't want to just talk about my lived experience. I wanted to talk about other things and be seen as somebody, as not just my lived experience as being adopted. So
Yeah.
I thought, let me just apply and do this PhD.
Right. With as important as lived experience is, it can be viewed as anecdotal by a lot of people who are eager to dismiss it, right? And see that that's an isolated incident.
Yeah.
Other people had a good experience of this, and you aren't even saying you had a bad experience. I didn't have a bad
No,
experience, but I'm also in
no.
agreement with you about abolition, for example. So it had very little to do with the experience I had. It had to do with whether I thought this was a system that should exist. And I don't think, I wish it did not. So I wondered if you would like to speak a little bit about what you did decide to do your PhD on, and a little bit about
Yeah.
your research. Great.
So, so I think naturally most PhDs probably change as you go through the whole experience. And so mine, like I said, started off as being this idea to critique kind of how like non-adoptees respond to adoptees on Twitter. And then it actually turned into more about narratives, adoption narratives, adoptee identity, and then the social media aspect. And then in my first year, when I first started researching, I realized I couldn't talk about adoption as a system without talking about colonialism as well, because the two are very much entwined. And so I started to kind of research just kind of the links and kind of how colonialism can potentially impact on adoption when we think about transracial adoption or adoption in general, like the system, how our birth certificates are changed. And to me, there feels like a massive sense of ownership. And I really wanted to have a look into that, but through the eyes of people who are adopted. So that was kind of my starting point. Um, and then and then I started to look at media narratives of adoption as well, and how, as adoptees, we experience, or how maybe some media narratives that we see don't actually align with our own experiences of adoption. And so, therefore, I wanted to interview other adoptees and just get their thoughts on that. And then I was also really interested in, okay, well, I came to this from a social media aspect. So I'm interested in how, as adoptees, we use social media to talk about adoption.
Yes.
And do we use that to challenge the narratives? Or so, yeah, so these were some of the questions. So what I did with my research was I looked at data from October and November, so to cover National Adoption Week here, and then obviously National Adoption Month in over where you are. And so
Right.
I drew data from tweets across a period of 5 years, because when I was looking originally, I could see that adoptee Twitter kind of exploded around like a 5 year period. And then obviously over the last 2 years, it's gone very quiet because of the changes in ownership, and it's not the same anymore. And lots of adoptees kind of fell off Twitter, and we
Right.
started to look for other platforms, right? So yeah, I drew data and then used some of that data to as prompts in my interviews with adoptees. So I focused my research on the UK specifically because I was sick of being told that adoption is not the same here as it is in America. So if you ever say over here about adoption or you critique it, you always get told, well, it doesn't work like how America works. We don't buy and sell children, but money still exchanges hands here. It just exchanges hands in a different way. So the UK always want to be seen as like, we're not like America in terms of adoption. We're good
Very
here.
interesting.
And
Yeah.
so I was just a bit like, well, no, because there are still very similar themes that occur, just in different ways, in more subtle ways here. So I focused it specifically on the UK because I want the UK to realise this and see this.
Wow.
So
Yes.
yes, I interviewed UK adoptees and then used some of the prompts, which were directly, they were anonymous prompts from Adoptee Twitter, and spent time asking them 10 questions about their thoughts on these prompts and then 10 questions on their use of social media. So that's kind of, and also media narratives of adoption. So that's kind of how my thesis developed and what I've explored and looked at. And pretty much the majority of all of my participants share very similar views. And so it's very interesting reading some of the quotes that have been told to me. And yeah, there are just so many themes that relate to many of my adoptees. So for example, when I've looked very much at like media narratives of adoption, and like there's nothing in my thesis that if you're adopted, you're going to be surprised at. I think if you're not adopted, you'll be like, oh my gosh, this is like, how can these people say these things? But, and it was interesting because I was talking to somebody who a while ago, and they said to me, I was being questioned on my research, and they said to me, so what's your contribution to the field? And I think, and they were like, was there anything in your findings that surprised you? And I said, no, there's nothing in my findings that surprised me. And they were a bit like, why? Because obviously a PhD is you're meant to bring new knowledge to the field. You're meant to be finding a gap in the literature, right? And so they were a bit puzzled as to why there was nothing in my findings that surprised me. And I said to them, like, as an adoptee, there is absolutely nothing in this research that I am surprised at. For me, what I'm doing is basically shining a light on what actually adoptees have been saying for a long time. The only difference is that I'm just using academia to shine a light on it. And so my whole thesis is a contribution to the literature, because in the UK, my work is new. Like from my literature review, when I've been looking at other academics' work, the US are further ahead than what we are in the UK in terms of critical adoption studies. But my work is new here, so it is something that, you know, if you're not adopted, you'll be like, what is this about, you know? But if you were to read my thesis, you probably wouldn't be surprised at a lot of the findings that I have, because as adoptees, we're used to this, we know this.
Yeah.
So so for example, like I've got a chapter on media narratives of adoption, and the participants shared with me about how they were feeling about the narratives. So we have like the polarization of narratives, where you get the gratefulness narrative, the savior narrative, or you get adoptees seen as villains and kind of destroying adoptive families. So you get this like sensationalization of adoption, and then this
Yeah.
moral panic about adoption. So, you know, there's nothing in my thesis that I think is like surprising. All it is just unearthing what as adoptees we've been speaking about, but just in an academic way. So yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, one aspect of my research. And then I've also been looking at how social media platforms provide a space for us as adoptees to take ownership of language, because a lot of what we've grown up with are these dominant narratives of adoption. So we're told about adoption through the eyes of social workers, right? Or through the eyes of the lenses that our adoptive parents have made, they've created a story for us, which is our early entrance narratives. And that is what we've grown up believing and knowing about being adopted. And then as we go through life, that's really when we start to make our own thoughts up about adoption. And so I've used the adoptee consciousness model because for me, that feels the most appropriate model to use in order to be able to analyze my research by. So I looked at status quo. So for those of you who don't know the adoptee consciousness model, there are 5 different touchstones. And so you've got status quo, rupture, dissonance, expansiveness, and agency. I'd highly recommend checking it out because I think it's the most useful model for us as adoptees. So I've used that model to analyze my research through, to look at how as adoptees we process our thoughts through our different life stages, but our thoughts on narratives, our thoughts on media, and kind of looking at how we identify through and process our own feelings. And so it's been a really interesting research project personally, but also looking at how, like, my adoptees, the adoptees that I interviewed spoke about finding like and naming their experience for the first time through the use of social media platforms. And for the first time, they've been able to have a language that they didn't have before for their own adoption experiences, because we're grown up being told one narrative about being adopted. And for a lot of us, this is where there's confusion, right? Because what we're being told doesn't always match up how we're feeling. And so we're being told one thing, but we're feeling something else. And that's where you get the anger and the confusion in. And then we don't have an outlet to be able to talk or express that. And so and I don't know if it's the same over in the US, but over here, we don't have many adoptee spaces physically in the UK to actually meet another adoptee. And so for many of the participants, the first time that they were meeting other adoptees was online. And for a lot of them, they felt this validation aspect of it, that finally they're meeting another adoptee who understands what they're going through, and they're able to talk about it and share about it and process and learn. And so, yeah, that's kind of a bit about kind of my research and where I've come from with it and where I'm going with it. And it's been beautiful for me as a researcher. I had one participant who said to me, I would never have, if I hadn't known you were adopted, I wouldn't have shared a lot of this. So again, it's really important for us as adoptees to be researching our experiences, because I know that when I was doing my literature review, I got so triggered reading a lot of the literature, the academic literature that has been written about adoption and narratives. I was triggered because a lot of it is just this like savior narrative, this adoption's beautiful narrative. And I really struggled. Like, when I tell you I struggled. Like, there have been moments in my PhD where I've had to drink. I'm not going to lie, I've drank in all stuff from non-adoptees who are academics, and being like, this does not match up to my experience of adoption. Why are they writing about this? And research can be, in my eyes, quite biased when you think about what is this research for, right? Like, a lot of academics I feel use research to prove why, or proves probably the wrong word, but you know, they come from this invested reason
Yes.
why adoption should exist, or the benefits of adoption, right? We don't have that many, and I'm talking specifically about the UK. There's probably 1 or 2 critical adoption study academics that I could quote, or like, it's a very niche area that's very new. And again, when I first started talking about this area, and I described myself, this is going back 4 years, and I described myself as a critical adoption scholar, I literally, somebody who worked in the sector said to me, oh no, we shouldn't critique adoption, like
No.
that we shouldn't do that. And I'm like, but why should we not critique adoption? How has it become this like pillar, this cornerstone that we cannot touch, we cannot talk negatively about, we can't critique it? That doesn't seem right to me. So a lot of what I do does critique adoption, and it's because I'm sick of seeing these binaries of like, adoption's negative, adoption's positive. But actually, like, our experiences of adoptees are so like nuanced and complex, and I think that um we do like struggle our own selves to really understand our own adoption experiences, and it then becomes harder when you've got somebody else telling you how you should think, how you should believe, how you should feel about being adopted. So yeah, so I think a lot of my research is very personal, but it's also been very like edifying, um reading and kind of knowing that actually my work is
Mm.
creating this niche and is filling a gap in the literature, because we do not have that many adoptee academics in the UK who, well, we don't have many adoptee academics as a starter, and we don't
Right.
have who are working in critical adoption studies or working in adoption. So yeah, I think it's great that personally I'm doing this work.
Great. Yeah, and I resonate so much with it because it was exactly my experience coming out of the fog through the agency of joining social media, finding adoptees and going, what in the world is this? I had no idea these people existed and that they feel this way and that they're saying these. And it's exactly as you said, there were concepts and language that I probably had the concepts in an unformed way in my mind, but I didn't have the language until suddenly I could hear other people who had worked on these things. And yeah, we do have a fortunate situation of there are some real strong local groups. Like there are a number of people in the meeting here that I have the good fortune to be able to see in person every month. So it's too bad to hear that maybe that's not such a thing, a presence in the UK or other places that meetups and an actual getting together locally of adoptees is not something that's really enjoyed. Do you think there's a reason for that? Is it just that no one knows how to
Yeah,
organize it or?
I think that it's getting, so there are groups now. There wasn't,
Okay.
I would say,
Oh,
about
I see.
6 years ago. So I think around sort of 2019, 2020. But I think the way that adoption in the UK kind of is set up in terms of there are lots of adoption organisations that are started by adoptive parents. And I think there is this element of secrecy, right? That's just embedded naturally in society about talking about adoption. And
Okay.
so I think for many adoptees are like we just don't talk, we don't meet one another, and it was
Mhm.
social media that has brought a lot of these groups together. But so I don't know how it obviously in the US it starts, but in the UK there are very few adoptee groups, and they are
Mhm.
getting bigger. There is more of a movement, but I think a lot of it was birthed from social media. A lot of it was birthed from adoptees talking on Twitter or meeting each other on Instagram. But I think it's just naturally just how adoption in the UK is set up. And also there's no infrastructure. So I'm presuming it's probably the same over in the US. I don't know. But here, like a lot of these organizations are grassroots, right? So they depend on adoptees to be able to facilitate it and keep that
Mhm.
going, which obviously is very, very difficult when you've got your own life and you are trying to battle your own kind of experience and your own thoughts and feelings of adoption. There's no infrastructure to keep adoptee peer support groups together. And I think that is something that you see is slightly different, I think, in terms of like I'll speak about the adoption sector here in the UK, but like there is funding available, but a lot of that funding goes to adoptive parents to
Mhm.
help their young adoptees, right? But if we're
Yeah.
talking about adult adoptees in the UK, there is no funding or structure. So that then makes it very difficult because you are literally relying on grassroots advocacy work, which is fine, but to infrastructure that and to keep that going and existing, how how do we facilitate that, right? So I think
Yes.
it's a very challenging place to be in, and I admire adoptees. I mean, I did found an adoptee peer support group myself, so I know how challenging and difficult it is to run a group. um, but yeah, I think we are definitely getting bigger in terms of more adoptees mobilizing and talking about it and feeling comfortable to talk about it. But again, I think it's that kind of feeling free and feeling like we can talk about it. It's like when I've interviewed my participants, quite a lot of them said that they don't feel they can talk about adoption. Even as an adult, they do not feel they can talk about adoption unless their adoptive parents are dead. And there is a quote by Anne Heffron who said exactly the same thing, which I posted on my LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. But I think it revolves around this secrecy, right? And I think we, as adoptees, like, we need to keep inspiring one another to be sharing our stories, because unless we hear another adoptee share their story, we probably don't feel that comfortable and able to talk about our own. So that's one of the reasons why I guess I'm quite open as a person, but I've definitely, I think, become more open in using LinkedIn, because
I'd ask about it.
as
Yeah.
Twitter as a platform just kind of fell by the wayside. And I
Yeah.
was just like, okay, well, what do I do now? And so I started to use my LinkedIn. I guess maybe I just naturally evolved to start using my LinkedIn as more of a place to talk about adoption, because that is my research. And so I do feel that I can be more free now to share my story more on I guess it's more of a professional platform, if you can call it that. But like, if you'd spoken to me 5 years ago, I definitely wouldn't have been sharing my story on LinkedIn. So I think
Yeah.
as a person, I have changed and evolved, and I really am at that place where I just don't care anymore. Like, I'm just, think what you want about me talking about adoption,
Yeah.
like, but this is how I feel, and my research backs it up. And I think that we just need to start talking more about this, and yeah, and sharing actually how it does feel, because it's systemic. It's not just about our own individual experiences.
That's how I found you, was on LinkedIn. And I must say, you're very consistent about, there's always something on there. It's great. I feel like, oh, she's gonna think I'm just always, yes, yes, yes. But that is the way I experience what you post, and also the things you link. And the people that are also in accord with the viewpoints, those are influential people in our community as well. And it's great to see that there's like a constellation of them that are supporting each other. So I hope that's
Yeah.
your experience of it as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's really important that we keep developing these networks, and that we keep yeah, sharing our thoughts, because it inspires the adoptees as well. Oh,
Before
yes,
we,
I've just seen
oh
in the
yeah,
chat Long
there
Lost
you go.
Family UK. So
Oh,
interestingly, Long Lost Family has been brought up a lot in my research, and it is not a program that, as adoptees, my adoptees identify with. It's a very problematic program. So personally, I don't watch it. It triggers me. I wouldn't recommend any adoptee to watch it. It's it's one of those, they sensationalize adoption in it, and like reunion, specifically reunion. And so majority of my participants actually brought it up as quite negative, but they do. And I don't know if any of you've heard of How to Be Adopted. So How to Be Adopted in the UK is a blog site, and Claire, who runs How to Be Adopted, she actually emailed them for to raise her concerns, and her she's an adoptee, it's an adoptee led organization, and they replied back, and it was quite wasn't quite a great response that Long Lost Family replied back to her. So I would definitely check out that article on Claire's website. It's How to Be Adopted. But yeah, it's not a program that, as adoptees, as an adoptee, I would recommend personally. Yeah, someone's put reunion porn. Jen's put literally reunion
mhm.
porn.
Yeah, yeah. I would love to talk all night. And I know we can't do that. It's already very late where you are, but I wonder if, before we conclude here, if I could ask you real quick to comment on the revocation movement in the UK.
Yeah, of course. So I would say that it's probably less of a movement as such, and
Okay.
more of I guess, a calling. So in the UK, over the last, I would say, probably a couple of years, there is a movement called the Adult Adoptee Movement, who are calling for apology for forced adoptions from the government, historic forced adoptions by the government. And I think as part of that, and as a lot of adoptees who I've met or who I've spoken to, some of them want to revoke their adoption. And currently in the UK, that is not a situation that we can actually do. So I don't know if any of you have read recently, there was a court case last week for two adult adoptees who wanted to revoke their adoption and go back to their biological family. Their adoptive mum is in full support of it and is like pushing for it. And but the Supreme Court here ruled it that it wasn't, that they couldn't do it, that basically if they were to say yes, it would destabilize the adoption system. Like, just that in itself
That
just shows
statement.
you how they view adoption here, right? So like, you see how in the US, obviously the supply and demand, right? Over here, and this is the thing, like over here, people don't want to believe that it is the same, right? The supply and demand, and that as adoptees, we're products in this big kind of supply and demand chain, right? But that quote for me was really shows that actually we're very much products, because if they're that worried to revoke to rule revoking adoption because it may destabilize the system and that they would get less adopters recruiting, then that tells us something about how we are treated or seen as adoptees. And so yeah, I think that's a big moment for us, I think, here in the UK. But it made me very angry last week, because I was just like, if you didn't already know that that is how we're seen, then you should then read the case, and clearly that is how we are seen now. So like, yeah, so but there are lots of adoptees who are calling for this, who do want to go back to who do want to revoke their adoptions. And for me, it just shows how we're always owned by the state. Like, regardless of what age we are, the state hold our adoptions and we cannot revoke them. And I just don't believe that that is right. Like, none of us consented to being adopted. And we should be able to have power and agency. If we want to revoke our adoptions, we should be able to. The courts have the power to revoke our biological family. So why do we not have the power to revoke our adoptions? And I think, and it's a massive case for adoptee rights, and it really just shows how, as adoptees, we don't have rights, and so there's this. This is why I don't really align with the call for an apology, because as much as, yes, there should be an apology, right? I believe that. But there should also be change in adoption practice and in adoption law. And so the government can apologise all they want, but if there's not a change in adoption law and in adoption practice, then that apology is just air, because there's no change, right? So I'm just very much about, we should be able to have at least that as a right. We should be able to revoke our adoptions. I personally don't want to revoke my adoption, but I believe that as adoptees, that should be something that we are entitled to and can have, because we did not consent to our adoptions. And so I just very much see it as we're still owned by the state, regardless of what age we are, because if we cannot revoke our adoptions, then we're owned by the state. So yeah, so that's kind of my thoughts on revocation.
Well, thank you for spending a little time talking about that with us. I couldn't think of anybody with a more firsthand knowledge of what was going on. And I did see that. I did see the article, and I saw it on LinkedIn, and I probably saw it through you posting it and a couple of other people posting it. And I could see the outrage, and I certainly could relate to what that must be like. So I appreciate you sharing about that. And of course, everything that you've said here tonight, it's just been wonderful. I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to sit with us and explain things to us about how you've seen the evolution of your own story and the narrative. That's the strength of the narrative, and how your research is supporting the awareness that people should have, what we've known all along as adopted people, but that probably sounds like something earth-shattering and groundbreaking to somebody who hasn't lived that. And yeah, and you've made a very strong case here for the way the social media platforms give a voice to adoptees, and a place for people to find that resonance that really brings a form of healing by itself. Just realizing somebody else out there understands what you're going through. So I want to thank you again, Annalisa, for accepting the invite and making a late night of it. It's probably going to crash and sleep it off, I hope. But we're wishing you all success on and excited for you as you get closer to completing your dissertation. And we hope that you would come back again, maybe, and share more about that on the other side and how life looks there and the sort of projects you might be working on. But thanks again for coming out.
No, thank you. I've really appreciated it. Thank you for the invite.
Great. We're going to end just the recorded section for everybody on the call here, and then we can stay on and have a brief Q&A here. Hope everybody will join us again on Happy Hour and for other NAAP events. Have a good night.